Media bias. It's fair to say this is a major problem in society. Corporate media executives now control almost everything we hear, read, or see. The corporatization of news places profits above all else. And the best way to make money is to play into people's emotions. Bias in the media perpetuates polarization and undermines democracy. So today, I'll show you 3 ways to spot bias in the media so you can recognize how you might be getting persuaded.
I'm fascinated in this topic and finding your 3 ways that we can spot media bias, because I do think this is a big problem. When I go back home to Alabama and visit my family, I notice that they only watch one type of media and they're watching it almost 24 hours a day. And I think it's definitely persuading them to only know about certain things and not know about other things. When I bring up ideas that I believe in, they've never heard of it before. So I'm interested, first of all, how did we get into a situation where the media is allowed to be so partisan and biased?
Well, the corporatization of news is the main driver of media bias because companies emphasize profits above all else. Sometimes news sources rush to publish without verifying facts so they can beat the competition. For example, the New York Times recently published an editor's note about its coverage of the October 17th hospital bombing in Gaza City, stating that its early coverage of the blast relied too heavily on claims by Hamas and that the newspaper did not verify those claims before publishing. The editor's note also states that the report left readers with an incorrect impression about what was known and how credible the account was. In the age of social media, the news cycle moves incredibly quickly, sometimes faster than reporters can responsibly act. The result can be inaccurate, rushed reporting that requires retraction. And typically, retractions don't spread as widely as those initial reports, so the damage is already done. This does not mean that journalists and news outlets are purposely misleading the public. It means there's negligence in that the reporters are not empowered by their employers to follow a journalistic code of ethics, because employers are businesses and they've got to make money. They've got to get as much content out as fast as possible. And the New York Times just revealed how misinformation happens, even at a news source that the public widely regards as one of the most credible, where journalists and editors are supposed to properly source and verify reports before publishing. Even when news organizations have good intentions, they can still make mistakes due to internal business pressures. Let's look at the Times Board of Directors, because you're going to see a list of people who have worked in senior roles at companies including Google, Meta, JP Morgan Chase, Washington Mutual, and even some who have served in the US Treasury Department. The New York Times Corporate Governance Manifesto states that the board of directors is responsible for overseeing the direction, affairs, and management of the company to ensure that they are aligned with, wait for it, long-term interests of our stockholders. There you have it. The newspaper just admitted that it is beholden to its stockholders. So let's look at those stockholders. The largest includes Vanguard Group, Inc., which has invested over $1 billion in the largest international arms manufacturers and military contractors, over $780 million in nuclear weapons, and over $300 million in controversial weapons. This shows you just how war is a racket. Newspapers print articles about wars, and they do so to get the public behind those wars, to then promote those wars, which then contractors go into the war zones and they need to, get the US government to spend a bunch of money on them.
So the news is supposed to be the news, which is supposed to be some sort of public service, but now it's become a for-profit business. How did we get into the situation where the news is so partisan and so corporate now?
Deregulations, which started in the 1980s when the Fairness Doctrine was revoked. The Fairness Doctrine required radio and TV stations with FCC broadcast licenses to devote programming to controversial issues of public interest and require political pieces to contain opposing views. It also required broadcasters to give subjects of personal attacks the chance to respond. The idea was that the doctrine would create a non-commercial sector of America's airwaves. Opponents of the Fairness Doctrine argued that it wasn't actually fair and that it gave the big 3 networks at the time too much power and influence over the news. Back then, airwaves were limited. We did not have the internet, podcasts, and independent shows. Politicians, of course, took advantage of that. But the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine has resulted in the total corporatization of the news media that is undermining journalism and discrediting one of the most essential public services. Today, media bias is so prevalent that only 34% of Americans say they trust the mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. Big media pits viewers against each other to protect corporate power in America.
There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon.
Fairness Doctrine, that's a big deal that people don't know about. It's too bad we can't vote that back into existence. Like, once it's gone, it's gone?
Yeah, pretty much, because anytime it's tried to get added back in, between administrations, we get a new leader of the FCC, and unfortunately, regardless of which party is in power, they're both pro-corporate. So it's very unlikely that that doctrine is going to come back into play, especially if they don't modernize it for today's technology.
Rats.
Politicians from both parties have promoted media deregulation as an accelerator of competition. But over the years, so many FCC rules have been dialed back or eliminated that competition has almost been completely squashed. Today, just 6 corporations control 90% of mainstream media and entertainment. This means they control what we read, see, and hear. And guess what? Those companies are owned by billionaires, which brings me to step number 1 in identifying media bias: investigate media ownership.
All right, step 1, let's hear it.
Look at Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post. Nearly 1/4 of all Americans under age 50 read this publication. More importantly, the Washington Post reaches more key business audience demographics than media that is dedicated solely to business and finance news. Wow, a businessman owns a newspaper where he can reach other business-minded people.
So does that mean that all the reporting at the Washington Post is also biased?
No, not necessarily. Important journalism has absolutely come out of that paper. Reporters have won Pulitzer Prizes there, and we journalists need to protect each other at a time when journalists are imprisoned globally at record highs and harassed or physically attacked. But we need to acknowledge the fact that there are conflicts of interest at media outlets so people can think critically about the content they consume and understand the motives of media owners. The Columbia Journalism Review states pretty much every public policy issue that the Post covers affects Bezos' sprawling personal and business interests. The very existence of people as rich as Bezos clashes with the notion of economic fairness. Don't blame journalists for the abysmal state of modern media. Blame their corporate overlords for turning news into a form of entertainment. With the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos can influence readers who are already business-minded by promoting stories that benefit the corporate agenda.
If I know anything about rich people, it's that they hate regulations, and they want you to hate regulations too.
Yes, and readers are just voters. Remember, newspapers don't only publish news reports, they also publish opinion pieces. Jeff Bezos has more influence on our lives than we like to admit. So does Elon Musk, who owns X, formerly known as Twitter, and Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of Meta, previously Facebook, and now he also owns Instagram. These privately owned social media companies are popularly and incorrectly considered modern town squares, where free speech and public discourse are allowed. But they're not. They're private companies and they control the narrative. Independent content creators like us know this all too well. Every single time one of my stories gets flagged for violating arbitrary terms that are not applied equally across the platform.
Yep, I know that pain.
Yeah, and there's no way to easily counter their claims to try to restore your content.
Nope, unless you go post on some obscuro platform that no one's ever going to download.
Yeah, and get no views.
And get no views. So the top 3 richest people in the world each control their own media outlet, so they can persuade people to think whatever benefits their pocketbooks, probably. So that's good to know. So what's your second step in spotting media bias?
Well, step 2 for spotting biased news is identify biased language. It's important to think critically about everything you consume, whether it's on a major TV network, in a mainstream newspaper, or on the fringes of social media. Reporters are supposed to be objective and present events in a neutral, unbiased manner. regardless of their personal beliefs. But today, many journalists regard themselves as activists. They take stances on issues that they believe are important, from alleged apartheid in Palestinian territories, to abortion, to climate change. Look, I get it, but that is not the job. So, as consumers, we have a responsibility to think critically about world events and challenge ourselves by consuming news from a variety of different sources. If you only read US media, check out foreign sources, state media, public media, and independent media. If you mainly consume news from liberal sources, check out the same stories at conservative outlets. Notice the language. Let's take abortion, for example. You know what a media outlet's bias is when certain phrases are used, like pro-life or pro-choice, rather than simply stating the phrase abortion. Reporters elicit more emotion by using specific language. The same applies to international conflicts. You'll often see American media referring to rebels as, quote, pro-democracy protesters, if said rebels are protesting a government that the US considers is an adversary, like China. Notice how American media outlets did not call Hong Kong protesters anti-government protesters? That is on purpose. Calling the people you align with anti-government forces makes them sound like they're the bad guys in a story, rather than the good pro-democracy guys.
Right, so in the Star Wars universe, the good guys that we're rooting for, Han Solo and the rebels, from the Empire's point of view, they would be called anti-government protesters, and the bad guys, and their media, if they had it. So what's your third step for identifying media bias?
Step 3, understand when a journalist is serving as a news reporter and when they're serving as a talk show host or commentator, like former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, who presented his opinions every night to the public while he was employed at Fox.
Rupert Murdoch is admitting that some Fox News hosts endorsed false allegations by former President Trump and his allies that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. That's according to excerpts of a deposition unsealed Monday.
Sometimes it's hard to know what a presenter's role is because they do hard news and commentary.
So how does all this make you feel as a journalist, knowing that if you were to work at a lot of these corporations, you would have to uphold their bias that came from the wealthy person at the top?
Really sad. Journalists are supposed to expose corruption, give a voice to the voiceless, keep an eye on governments, and hold those in power accountable. Journalism strengthens democracy. I'm sad to see the rules that empowered us to do this job well have been rescinded. Journalists are just people who need to pay their bills like everyone else. This doesn't necessarily mean someone at the top is directly instructing them on how or what to report. But journalists will often tell you they self-censor because they know the assignment and who's paying the bills. So a journalist at the Washington Post might just stop reporting on Amazon or Jeff Bezos altogether, or they might go light on him. But sometimes journalists are ordered to follow a specific narrative. For example, leadership at Europe's most prominent news aggregation app, Upday, instructed employees to present the company's coverage of the war in Gaza with a pro-Israel slant. Documents obtained by the independent, nonprofit news outlet, The Intercept, reveal that Upday told staff to prioritize the Israeli perspective and minimize Palestinian civilian deaths. Upday is owned by Axel Springer, which is majority owned by the Manhattan-based private equity firm KKR. Since 2015, KKR has heavily invested in Israeli technology companies. Instead of acknowledging Palestinian deaths, it's more profitable to pretend they're not dying, and instead to de-rank stories that might tell a bigger picture. Everyone should exercise caution when ingesting news reports and online content, especially when it comes to documenting wars, because civilians are suffering, and biased media outlets make it worse by pitting groups against each other, all for corporate gain, when they're supposed to zoom out and give more context and nuance to world events.
So then you can only really get certain stories from watching independent news outlets. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But unfortunately, our independent voices don't get carried as far and wide as these mainstream outlets because we don't have the resources. And because big companies like Google own YouTube and the algorithms, so it's much harder.
Yeah, it's a problem. It's also a problem to try to get people to watch independent news outlets like certain family members I have. I went back home once and I made them a list of the top 10, independent channels that I watch on YouTube. I even set them up a YouTube channel for to watch it. And then the next time I went to visit, I oh, so what did you think? And they were like, huh, what? Oh, yeah, and they just totally forgot about that. Went right back to watching the same channel 24 hours a day.
So you're saying this listicle episode is not gonna get people to watch?
No, this will be the thing, finally.
Oh, okay, good, because I don't like listicles, but here I am.
They might watch a video that I made.
Great, send them this one.
If you can get people to watch independent news media, do you think that can help solve the problem of media bias?
Absolutely. You'd have way more voices and choices and a lot more competition. But if you're looking for real independent investigative journalism, check out some of these sources. They break incredibly important stories. And also check out independent sources on YouTube. Just be sure to note that there are a lot of commentators mixed in with journalists, but still, you'll hear a variety of different takes that you would not hear on corporate media. But of course, independent media needs our support, so be sure to give them any donations and share their content if you like what they're doing. More and more content creators are working independently, but they still have to publish with companies that have monopolistic power, like Google's YouTube, Meta, Instagram, TikTok, etc. This is where we need a decentralized, open source media platform, one that's actually user-friendly.
Ooh, a decentralized news platform. That would make a good topic for a future episode.
To educate yourself more on this topic, please read Noam Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent, which outlines how governments, elites, and corporations manipulate the public into supporting special interests that dominate the private sector. Until then, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button to get more independent news content like this. Thanks for watching. I'm Brigida.
Good job. You know, when I first found that Noam Chomsky book on manufacturing consent, that was a big deal. That really opened a lot of eyes for me.
Great. Also read War is a Racket.
Ah, I didn't know about that one. Great.